Microsoft is the biggest software company on the planet and also the second biggest cloud provider. But to understand how Microsoft actually makes money, it helps to start with the three segments the company reports its revenue under: productivity and business processes, intelligent cloud, and more personal computing. Together, these three make up the entire business, and each one carries a very different weight, a different growth story, and a different role in where Microsoft is headed. Let's begin. The first segment is productivity and business processes, with 42% of revenue and 54% of operating income. The segment is structurally divided into four core operational pillars: Office Commercial, that's the big one, Office Consumer, LinkedIn Ecosystem, and Dynamics and the Power Platform. Office Commercial is by far the biggest part of that segment, with 70% of productivity and business processes and 31% of total revenue. This is Microsoft's flagship and what they are primarily known for, except maybe for Windows. To make it easier to understand, I structured it into three categories because they have a lot of different applications and it can be confusing, especially the bundling. Everybody knows about Word, PowerPoint, and Excel, and they are pretty self-explained. In this section, I want to shift the focus more on the apps that a lot of investors kind of forget, or at least don't really acknowledge. But they are the real reason why Microsoft is so hard to rip out of a company's workflow. Teams is the collaboration core. Messaging, channels, and video, with 320 million monthly active users disclosed by Microsoft in 2023, rising to 350 million plus by February 2025. It also functions as an application layer. Microsoft's own tools like SharePoint and Power BI and third-party software like Salesforce run as native tabs inside it. That turns Teams from a chat app into the entry point for most of an employee's daily software. Exchange Online and Outlook split front-end and back-end. Outlook is the daily interface for email and calendars. Exchange holds the infrastructure, mailboxes, compliance archives, and a global address list mapping every employee in the company. Migrating off Exchange means rebuilding security and compliance from scratch, which is why retention is so high. The second layer governs where enterprise data actually lives: storage, permissions, and how work gets tracked across teams. SharePoint Online is the structural core, an intranet and document management system that stores, secures, and publishes organizational content. It supports department portals for HR, legal, and IT with structured document governance, metadata tagging, approval workflows, and role-based access control. What's less visible is the role underneath Teams. Every file shared in a Teams channel is actually stored in an automatically provisioned SharePoint site collection, meaning SharePoint is the storage and permissions engine behind Teams collaboration, not a separate product running in parallel. OneDrive for Business is the individual counterpart, personal cloud storage for draft files and work in progress before it moves to SharePoint for team publications. It syncs natively into Windows File Explorer and Mac OS Finder, and supports controlled external sharing through time-limited links, view-only access, and password protection. The third layer handles protection and administration. Without it, Microsoft's stack has no place in enterprise, finance, or the public sector. It secures identities, manages devices, watches for threats, and keeps the organization compliant. Entra ID, formerly Azure Active Directory, is the identity core, arguably the most important piece here, since everything else leans on it. Log in once via single sign-on and access opens up across Microsoft 365, Azure, and third-party tools like Salesforce or Workday, which is exactly why standalone identity vendors struggle to compete. Conditional access checks risk in real time, device health, location, IP reputation, and privileged access gets granted just in time rather than sitting open indefinitely, cutting off a common path attackers use to move through a network. Identity gates everything else Microsoft sells, which is what makes Entra ID foundational rather than just another feature. Microsoft also owns Defender, which is a threat detection suite and one of the largest cybersecurity operations anywhere, covering mail, endpoints, identities, and collaboration tools as one system rather than a bolted-on product. It sandboxes email attachments to catch malware before delivery and checks links again at the moment they are clicked, since a link can turn malicious after the email already landed. On endpoints, it watches behavior rather than just signatures, which is how it catches ransomware and fileless malware that older antivirus tools miss. The logic behind it, Microsoft sells security as an extension of the productivity suite it already owns, using the same underlying data that powers Teams and Exchange. Microsoft Purview governs the data itself. It blocks sensitive data from leaving through unauthorized channels, and sensitivity labels keep documents encrypted even after they have left the network. It also handles legal holds and forensic search across Exchange, Teams, SharePoint, and OneDrive, which is what makes it usable in actual litigation, not just an internal checkbox. Together, the three form a loop. Entra ID decides who gets in, Defender watches, Purview governs what happens to the data once someone's inside. And all of that is bundled up, which is the reason why it's so hard to compete with them. They are not the best everywhere, but they are the most comfortable to use and also really price efficient in the amount of services they offer. Microsoft also owns LinkedIn, which produces 6% of total revenue. LinkedIn basically functions as Microsoft's B2B data infrastructure, the world's largest professional network and the closest thing Microsoft has to a live, constantly refreshing map of the working world. Talent Solutions makes up roughly half of revenue, monetized through per-seat subscriptions for tools like LinkedIn Recruiter and Learning, alongside pay-per-click job listings. Marketing Solutions accounts for about 40%, running on auction-based advertising sold on precise B2B targeting by job title, company size, and seniority. Now we come to a smaller segment, which is the consumer segment actually. Microsoft 365 Personal is the consumer counterpart to the commercial stack. The same core apps bundled with OneDrive and Copilot for individual subscribers. It's actually pretty small with roughly 2.7% of total revenue. Around the same size is Microsoft Dynamics. Microsoft Dynamics is also pretty small, with only 2.7% of total revenue. Dynamics 365 is Microsoft's ERP and CRM suite, bringing customer-facing data and back-office operations together on one cloud platform built on Azure. It directly competes with the likes of SAP and Salesforce, and actually holds a decent market share for how small it is in the Microsoft business. The next big segment is Intelligent Cloud, with 40% of revenue and 37% of operating income. The first and dominant subsegment is server products and cloud services, with 94% of Intelligent Cloud's revenue and 30% of total revenue. Azure is the product getting all the attention right now, and for good reason. It is the piece of Microsoft that's actually renting out the infrastructure everyone else's AI ambitions run on, and it's actually growing a lot. At the most basic level, Azure replaces the traditional model of a company building and running its own data centers. Infrastructure as a service, virtual machines, storage, networking lets enterprises rent hardware by the hour instead of sinking capital into servers they own. That shift alone changes how a CFO thinks about IT spend. What used to be a large upfront expense becomes a monthly operating cost that scales with actual demand, up or down, without a company ever touching a physical machine. Platform as a service goes a step further. Products like Azure SQL, a fully managed relational database for structured corporate data, Cosmos DB, a globally distributed NoSQL engine for real-time unstructured data, and Azure Kubernetes Service, a managed platform for orchestrating complex containerized applications, hand a company a fully managed environment. Microsoft handles the patching, the maintenance, and the background, while the customer just uploads code and data. That convenience is exactly what makes the margin so attractive for Microsoft. And it's also what makes the customer relationship so sticky. Once a company's database architecture is built around Cosmos DB, or its Kubernetes workloads are running on Azure Kubernetes Service, unwinding that and migrating elsewhere is a project few IT departments want to take on. The AI layer sits on top of that infrastructure. And this is where Microsoft positioning gets interesting. Rather than betting in the business on a single model being the long-term winner, Azure AI Foundry turns Microsoft into something closer to a marketplace. Enterprises get access to OpenAI's GPT models, Anthropic Cloud models, Meta's Llama, Mistral, and Microsoft's own fee models, all inside the same platform. The strategic logic here is almost indifferent to who wins the model race. It doesn't matter to Microsoft whether GPT, Claude, or an open weight model ends up dominating enterprise adoption. Well, they own roughly 30% of OpenAI, so I guess they would prefer that, as long as the compute those models run on is built through Azure. The other half of that AI pitch is security. And it's arguably the more important half for actually closing enterprise deals. Corporations have been slow to adopt generative AI, not because the technology isn't compelling, but because of two specific fears. That proprietary data might leak into a public model training set, and that the model might simply make things up with total confidence. Azure's answer is a wrapper of enterprise-grade security around every model it hosts, guaranteeing corporate prompts and internal documents never touch public training data, combined with retrieval augmented generation, in short RAG, through Azure AI Search, which grounds the model's answers in a company's actual internal documents rather than letting it improvise from general training data. That combination is what turns AI from an interesting demo into something a general counsel will actually sign off on. None of that AI layer works though without clean data to feed it. And that's the problem Microsoft Fabric is built to solve. For most large companies, data has historically lived scattered across incompatible systems. One tool for collection, another for analytics, a third for reporting, none of them talking to each other cleanly. Fabric consolidates all of it into a single lakehouse platform built around what Microsoft calls One Lake, essentially OneDrive, but for an entire company's structured and unstructured data. The payoff is that companies' data becomes instantly usable by both AI tools and business intelligence dashboards without the usual friction of migrating files between systems, which is what positions Fabric as the analytical nervous system sitting underneath everything else Microsoft sells into the enterprise. Azure is by far the largest piece of the intelligent cloud segment, though Microsoft doesn't break out the exact figure on its own. The way Azure actually converts all of this into revenue is worth understanding in its own right, because the pricing structure reveals a lot about who Microsoft is really building for. Pay-as-you-go billing is the most familiar mechanic. Customers pay per second or per gigabyte for whatever they consume, whether that's virtual machine compute hours, database throughput, storage volume, or data leaving the network. It's the entry point. Zero commitment, instant scalability, ideal for a startup or a workload that's still unpredictable. But the real money sits in the layer above that. Reserved instances lets enterprise customers commit to specific virtual machine types in a specific region for 1 or 3 years, in exchange for discounts that can run as high as 60 to 70% of standard rates. Saving plans offer a more flexible version of the same trade, a fixed hourly spend commitment across compute services broadly, rather than locked to a specific machine type, still worth well over 50% in discounts. Both mechanics do the same thing from Microsoft's side. They convert an uncertain, elastic revenue stream into something closer to a subscription, with enterprise customers locked into multi-year spending commitments in exchange for a lower headline price. AI workloads get their own pricing logic entirely, split between two models that serve very different kind of customers. Pay-per-token billing charges dynamically based on the volume of input and output tokens processed through models hosted in Azure AI Foundry. GPT, Claude, or an open weight model, which suits a customer whose usage is unpredictable or still ramping up. Provisioned throughput units flip that logic for high-volume customers. Instead of paying per token, a company reserves dedicated GPU cluster capacity for a flat monthly or annual fee, guaranteeing processing speed regardless of how usage spikes. For Microsoft, PTUs are the more attractive of the two. They lock in predictable margins and guaranteed GPU utilization, which matters enormously in a world where GPU capacity itself is the scarce resource. Let's switch to GitHub. GitHub is where most of the world's code gets written, stored and shipped, now layered with AI coding through Copilot and built-in security scanning. It monetizes through tiered per-seat subscriptions, free for individuals and paid for teams and enterprises, with Copilot sold as a premium add-on. The real value it offers to Microsoft is much more strategic, in my opinion. It gives Microsoft a direct line into how software gets built industry-wide, owning the repository, the pipeline, and increasingly the AI writing the code. But we can't forget the on-premise business. Even though it doesn't grow anymore, it's mature, saturated licensing revenue. But it's one of Microsoft's most underrated advantages, since so much of the world still runs on physical servers rather than the cloud. Windows Server and SQL Server dominate the world outright. Windows Server around 60 to 70% market share, and SQL servers, so the databases, in a rough duopoly with Oracle. But the real strategic piece is Azure Hybrid Benefit. Customers with existing software assurance can transfer those licenses straight into Azure, cutting cloud costs by 40 to 80% versus standard pricing. That gives Microsoft a migration path no competitor can match, since no one else owns the on-premise install base to begin with. The value here isn't growth, it's a captive bridge only Microsoft can offer. Enterprise and partner services. It's 2.5% of total revenue and about the size of Dynamics. Enterprise support services covers 24/7 technical support and contracts and dedicated account management for enterprise IT. Lastly, more personal computing. With 17% of revenue and 9% of operating income, is this a small and actually shrinking part of the business? So I will just mention it. It offers Xbox, advertising via Bing, and devices and Windows licenses. All those operations combined result to really high margins for a company of this size, and huge amount of operating cash flow. But what does Microsoft do with all this money? Well, in the past, Microsoft kept mostly all of its cash in the balance sheet and used the rest to buy back some shares and pay out a small dividend. But as you're all aware of, those times are over for now, because all those data centers and server racks are capital intensive. Which brings us to Microsoft's AI strategy. Ask most investors what Microsoft's AI strategy is, and you will get the same answer. It's Copilot, a chatbot in Word, a chatbot in Excel, a chatbot that summarizes your inbox. That's not wrong, exactly. It's just a storefront. Behind it sits something far less talked about and honestly far more defensible. Something Microsoft calls Microsoft IQ. You can't buy it, and there's no single model behind it. It's better understood as the connective tissue between a generic large language model and one specific company's reality. Everything Microsoft has built to take a model that knows nothing about your business and make it actually usable inside your business. The reason this layer needs to exist at all comes down to 3 failure modes that show up the moment you point a raw LLM at real corporate data. The first is straightforward, it's hallucination. A model with no grounded source of truth will simply invent an answer that sounds right, because sounding right is what it's optimized to do. The second is subtler, and in practice more damaging. A model can read a number out of a database perfectly well and still get it wrong, because it doesn't understand what the number means. Gross revenue and net revenue after rebates might sit one row apart in a SQL table. To a finance team, those are two different facts, and a model with no business context has no way to tell them apart. The third is a permission problem. An AI has no built-in instinct for which documents are public and which ones are board confidential. Left unmanaged, this is a compliance risk. Microsoft IQ's job is to sit between the model's reasoning and the company's actual data and resolve all 3 problems before an answer ever reaches a user, grounding responses in a verified internal information instead of letting the model guess, translating raw data into terms that mean something in business context, and enforcing the same access rules a human employee would already be bound by. That's the frame Microsoft is working from, and it explains why the company breaks the structure into 3 distinct pieces. Work IQ is built on Microsoft 365 and Microsoft Graph, and it covers the operational side of a company, how people actually work, reporting lines, who's in which meeting, what's being discussed in a given Teams channel, which emails carry weight and which don't, what project a given employee is midway through right now. This is what gives an AI agent situational awareness. Of a specific organization structure and rhythm, rather than a generic sense of how offices tend to function. Fabric IQ sits on Microsoft Fabric, OneLake, and Power BI semantic models, and it deals with structured data. The numbers living inside SAP, Salesforce, SQL systems, wherever a company's hard operational facts actually reside. Its function is translation, taking scattered, inconsistent database fields and mapping them onto standardized business concepts. A customer, an order, a supply chain delay, so that a revenue field in one system means the same thing as a revenue field in another. That consistency is what allows Fabric IQ to function as a single source of truth for financial metrics and KPIs, rather than each AI query getting a different answer depending on which underlying system it happens to touch. Foundry IQ is a bit more complex. Running on Azure AI Foundry, the Azure AI service, and retrieval augmented generation over vector databases covers everything that doesn't live in a database at all. Contracts, compliance policies, technical specs, internal handbooks, research reports. This is the piece that anchors an AI agent's behavior to a company's actual governance rules, so that when a model is asked to act inside a regulated process, it's referencing the real policy document rather than a generic, statistically plausible guess at what that policy probably says. Stacked together, the three pieces answer three different questions an enterprise AI agent needs answered before it can be trusted with real work. Work IQ tells it who's doing what. Fabric IQ tells it what the numbers actually mean. Foundry IQ tells it what's allowed. None of that shows up in a Copilot demo, which is exactly why most investors don't even pay attention. But the product Microsoft is actually building is everything that has to be true underneath it for that chat window to be trustworthy at enterprise scale. None of that is worth much though if it isn't locked down. An AI agent with access to Work IQ, Fabric IQ, and Foundry IQ simultaneously, reading mails, querying financial data, passing confidential contracts, is also an agent with an enormous amount of exposure if it's allowed to operate without constraint. That's precisely why Microsoft didn't build the IQ framework as something separate from the security layer covered earlier. It is built directly into it. Entra ID is what stops an agent from becoming its own security hole. Every autonomous agent gets its own digital identity, a service principal, or inherits the exact permissions of the employee who triggered it. In practice, that means an agent can never see anything through Work IQ, Fabric IQ, or Foundry IQ that the underlying user wasn't already allowed to see. The agent doesn't get broader access just because it's an AI. It's bound by the same permission structure a human employee already operates under. Purview does the equivalent job on the data itself. Sensitivity labels get enforced directly at the data layer. And when an agent pulls a protected document through Foundry IQ, whatever it produces from that document inherits the same classification automatically. A summary generated from a confidential contract doesn't quietly become an unclassified summary just because an AI wrote it. The label follows the content through the entire chain. Put together with the three IQ layers, this is what actually closes the loop. Work, Fabric, and Foundry IQ give an agent the exact content to be useful, and Entra ID and Purview make sure that that context never turns into a liability. It's the same logic running through Microsoft's entire enterprise stack. Identity decides who gets in, and governance decides what happens to the data once they are there. Just now extended to agents acting on a company's behalf rather than humans logging in directly. All of this stays abstract until you see it run through a single concrete scenario. Say a customer emails in with a defective product, or a sensor or a factory line flags a fault. That's the trigger. The moment the agent actually wakes up and starts working. The first thing it needs is process context. So it queries Work IQ through Microsoft Graph, using the MCP to actually reach in and pull the relevant information. Who's the account rep responsible for this customer? What's already been discussed about this issue in Teams? How urgent does this actually look based on the tone and history of the conversation? That gives the agent a sense of where this problem sits inside the organization before it touches a single number. From there, it moves to data context, querying Fabric IQ through one lake in direct lake mode. Using the business ontology sitting underneath Fabric, it can check something like whether the replacement part is actually in stock at a specific plant, or pull the current order value straight out of SAP. And because Fabric IQ is already translated that raw data into consistent business terms, the agent isn't guessing what this weird labeled field actually means. Then it needs knowledge context, which is where Foundry IQ comes in. The agent runs a search through Azure AI Search to pull the relevant warranty terms out of a PDF, a document that was never structured data to begin with. and hands everything it's gathered so far to the underlying model, which reasons through all three sources of context together and works out what the best resolution actually looks like. Only at that point does anything get executed, and only after security has sign off, Entra ID confirms the agent is operating under its own verified identity with no permissions beyond what it's actually entitled to. Purview checks that nothing confidential is about to get mislabeled or exposed in the process, and only once both of those checks clear does the agent actually act, triggering a spare part reorder automatically, say, and posting a notification into the relevant Teams channel so a human is looped in on what just happened. That was obviously a pretty shallow explanation, so I hope you can forgive me. Microsoft 365 Copilot runs roughly $30 per seat, with Copilot Studio as the build layer, and that subscription is also what grants Graph access in the first place. So it's licensing and gatekeeping in one. From there, the meter shifts to usage, reasoning through Azure AI priced either per token or through fixed rate provisioned throughput units, with routine work pushed to the cheaper fee-for models to keep margins intact. The Foundry IQ search itself draws on measured Azure AI search units. Even governance carries a price tag. Entra ID and Purview aren't compliance overhead so much as their own line of revenue, one that a rival's agent, like Salesforce, Agentforce, or SAP Joule, ends up paying too, the moment it reaches into a Microsoft environment through the Model Context Protocol. After researching this company for roughly 200 hours, I learned a lot of different stuff about Microsoft and the industry in general. My plan with this content is not to tell you which stocks to buy or not to buy. I'm just here to give you the tools that help you make better decisions. Microsoft has a lot of risk involved. The main one, in my opinion, is that the business is just super complex in general, with so many different businesses, all with their individual problems and too difficult to understand, how Charlie Munger would phrase it. From AI cannibalizing their own software to spending a lot of money on compute. Even though we are not seeing cannibalization yet, and the capex is generating a lot of money, we don't know what the future will be. If you enjoyed this type of content, I'm sure you will like this one, where I talk about a company that is basically the operating system of small businesses.